Welcome everyone to our CFE support series. Today, this is our fourth webinar in our series, and it's all about time management and day 3. And my name is Debbie Bayless. So first of all, I want to extend a big thank you to CPA Western School of Business, CPA Ontario, and CPA Atlantic School of Business for their great partnership in ensuring this valuable information is available to you as you prepare to write CFE in June. This webinar is approximately 65 minutes, and then I'm going to open the floor for any questions that you may have. If you have questions during this webinar, please use the Q&A function. So again, please use the Q&A function and my colleagues will answer your questions. They may decide to save some of them for Q&A at the end. If due to time constraints, we're not able to answer your question, or you find after the webinar you have other questions you'd like to ask, please do not hesitate to reach out to your region or to your province. I've included their email addresses here. So there are two common questions that we're always asked. Is this webinar recorded? And yes, it is recorded. It will be available in D2L under the Introduction to Capstone 2 and CFE in the next few days. The 3 webinars that have already been completed, most of them are already posted, and the one that I did yesterday, that will be posted shortly. So let's talk about our agenda today. A very important key success factor that's needed in order to increase your chances of passing CFE is being able to create an effective and efficient outline. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about critical reading, outlining, and planning. So we're going to create an outline using a best practice I want to share with you for a day 3 case, Tiny Code. I'm also going to talk about the different types of triggers to be on the lookout when you're reading your case. Many candidates have shared with me that they struggle figuring out the appropriate quantitative tool and quantitative analysis they should perform. So I'm going to spend some time reviewing the common tools, the types of questions they answer, and the types of information they provide to the user. Now, there are several areas that the Board of Examiners find that candidates tend to be challenged with. And they are, for some, unfortunately, the reason or detrimental to them not passing CFE. So I want to spend time talking about one of the top 3 reasons candidates don't pass is time management. So I'm going to be sharing best practices. And that includes around appropriate writing strategies, including appropriate discussion frameworks and structures to use. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to provide you with all kinds of solutions and best practices that address those common challenges the Board of Examiners have found that candidates face when they write CFE. So let's start with critical reading, outlining, and planning. So first of all, I've included here, so you know what? Make sure that you go back to the recording because this is how you can access the case that I'm going to create the outline for today. For those of you who are enrolled in Capstone 2, you will, during the module workshop that's upcoming in the next, not this weekend, but in the next few weeks, you will be creating an outline and your response for this day 3 case. You will be submitting it and the National Marking Center will be marking it. So some of the common challenges the Board of Examiners find is that candidates are missing key case facts. And lots of times they're unsure of what they're being specifically asked to do. So as I create this outline, I'm going to share some best practices to increase your chances of mitigating these common challenges. So first of all, as I did yesterday when I talked about path to competent and day two, let's talk about the importance of creating an outline. And again, I want to emphasize this is an outline that includes the relative and the relevant information that you can quickly turn into your response. It's not simply a shell that just states what the requirements are. So one of the common challenges is that candidates haven't highlighted the key case facts. Well, when you're creating your outline, it's important to extract those relevant case facts and include them in your outline. So that helps address that particular challenge. If you include all the relevant information and you have the proper structure in place, then what happens is that that's really going to help you with time management. When you use this best practice, it becomes your roadmap for your response. And I'm also going to share with you a best practice that helps clarify what you're being asked to do. So it's important to write the required word for word and break it down into smaller pieces. Because the fundamental principle is whatever you're asked to do, it's important that you do that to the best of your ability. That increases your chances of achieving a competent response. And again, if you have all the relevant information in your outline, you have the structure in place, it allows you to see the big picture. You have a good sense of how much information you already have, and it helps you to determine how much time you should allocate for each of those assessment opportunities. So the best practice I'm going to show you is to create an outline electronically. So to create it in Word. And there are a lot of advantages to do that because first and foremost, everything you need is already in that document. And that document is where you need to create your response. You can create the headings for each of your requireds. The last point is it may be faster. And I'd like to argue the point that it is based on all of my personal experience working one-on-one with candidates, it is faster. Ask yourself a question. If you spent 20 minutes creating an outline on paper, is it going to take you an additional 5, 6 minutes to transpose all of that information that you have on the page, on paper, into Word? If that's the case, why not just forget that first step? Now I know that everybody has their own personal preferences and you have to figure out what works best for you. And we all have different learning styles. One of the things is some people see things in pictures or they like to draw connections. And that can't easily be done if you're creating your outline in Word. However, my advice would be extract the relevant case facts, create that structure for your outline, and if you need to be able to kind of link some of the information together, then draw that on one of the blank pieces of paper that you're given in your rough booklet. Now, there are some disadvantages, and I am going to provide you with some strategies to mitigate those. The need to scroll up and down to see those requireds and to see the snapshot of all of the things that you need to do. One of the things I've known and seen as an exam supervisor is, depending on how good your eyesight is, some candidates, when they have Word up, they actually are looking at 2 pages at a time. So that reduces the amount of scrolling that you need to. That wouldn't work for me. My eyesight's not that good. So one of the things is there is a function you can use, the Alt Find within Word. That is one of the shortcuts. There's very few shortcuts that you can use, but that shortcut works. So that allow you to find kind of the keyword and where you want to put that information. I am going to provide you some other strategies when it comes to being able to have a clear sense of what the requireds are, and that's always top of mind, and your time allocation. So I'll point that out shortly. So let's spend some time creating an outline for the day 3 case, TinyCo. Throughout this process, I'm going to go through the 9 steps of the planning process as CPA Canada recommends. You're going to notice on your screen that I have information from the case. For illustration purposes only, what I've done is I've highlighted the relevant case facts. I've also included in bold, in red, where that information would fall in my outline. But I want to be very clear. When I'm creating an outline, I am not spending time highlighting, writing in the margin, writing on the case, and then typing that information. I'm reading the information, and if it's important, I'm going to include it in my outline. I'm only highlighting here and putting comments in so that you can see where I extracted that information. So let's start with step 1. And that is to allocate time to planning. So the recommendation is that you allocate between 25 and 30% of the time for planning. Day 3, you're going to have a minimum of 3 to 4 cases. So time management is critical, which means the planning process is critical. So in this aspect, I'm going to allocate, for the best practice that I'm showing you, I'm going to allocate 25 minutes. So I'm going to put my start time, 9 o'clock, my finish time at 9:25. The remaining 50 minutes I'm going to dedicate to writing. Now I'm going to break that down a little bit more because I'm going to break it down and allocate time specifically for each of the requirements. And I'm doing that when I'm doing my time allocation. I'm not writing it in Word so that I don't have to scroll up and down. Again, I'm going to take a blank page out of my rough booklet and I'm going to put that information off to the side. So it's very close to my keyboard and I can always be watching the clock and looking at that information. So step 2 is all about reading the narrative. So let's start to extract the relevant information. So in the first few paragraphs, we've identified the users. So we've got Christopher and we've got Sean. They're giving us some important information about their experience. And I'm sitting here going, there's an obvious reason, I don't know yet, but I'm going to extract that information and include it in my outline. The best thing about Word is once it's in your outline, you can move it around to the appropriate spot. As far as our role, it's important to know who we are because it determines the voice we use when we write our response. So we work for a public accounting firm. At the timeline in this particular instance, the timeline is it's currently February the 1st and year end is December the 31st. So now let's look at the next paragraph is our first required. You'll notice I have R1 and I'm doing that just so that for those of you who are going to be in Capstone 2 and have access to the Capstone 2 feedback guide, it relates to the first assessment opportunity. But you would never put in a professional, memo to a client R1. So we're going to use the heading appropriate business model. And what we're being asked to do is to perform a quantitative analysis. And they're asking us, we need to answer 2 questions. We need to determine the best model given the demand for each selling price. and the selling price for the chosen model. So again, I've taken that required and I've broken it down into two parts because I need to make sure that I do both of them. I've included a subheading for assumptions and I put a question mark because I want to be on the lookout. Are there some key assumptions that the case is telling me, they're providing me with some information that indicates that assumption may be different than what I'm using, which would have potentially a positive or negative impact on the quantitative analysis. So for example, if I'm using revenue growth of 10%, but industry growth is only 5%, then that's an important assumption to highlight. And it's important to say that the 10% might be overly optimistic. And if it is more in line with industry benchmarks, that would have a negative impact on, in this instance, profitability. So again, be on the lookout for information when it comes to the assumptions. And you only need to discuss them if there's information in the case that indicates it could be different than what you're using in your calculations. Under recommendations, I need to provide that recommendation for the best model and the appropriate selling price. So now let's look at the next paragraph. Well, we need to talk about funding sourcing. There's my heading. An important case fact is that there's $600,000 for setup costs that's needed by the end of the spring. So they're asking us to discuss the advantages, the disadvantages, and to provide a recommendation. Now, I'm going to include a note to myself. Make sure you talk about the why. What's the potential positive or negative impact? Because I know in order to achieve a competent response, I need to not only meet the breadth, so the sufficient number of quantitative factors, but I also need to meet the depth requirements, which is answering that question, so what? What is the potential positive or negative impact? So I want to remind myself to do that. The next one, the next paragraph, there's two more requireds. So we need to account for the grant. It's a financial reporting issue. So I know the discussion framework or the proper structure to use is IGAR or IGAR-I. So issue, gap, it's ASPE. I'm going to put that in there. Analysis, I need to talk about the funds received, the potential repayments, recommendations. I need to provide recommendations on the funds received, the potential repayments. Another required is audit procedures for the grant. So I know when I'm providing procedures, again, a wonderful discussion framework to use is WRAP. So identify the risk, the account or accounts and assertions impacted, and the procedure. So again, I've included that. What's great about Word is you can copy. So if there's more than one risk, I can copy that format. The next paragraph is that they're asking us to perform a SWOT analysis. That's why they were giving me all that information about the brother, their relationship, their working relationship, their experience. I know when I'm doing a SWOT, I know that I not only need to include the relevant case facts, I need to include the why and the impact. So now I'm going to take that information I had already extracted and I'm going to put the appropriate information under the strengths and weaknesses. If you notice, one of the things I have is an equal sign. Now, I'm doing that to remind myself, Debbie, go back because I've got the relevant case fact. And you notice I'm just summarizing it very, very clear and concise. The equal sign means I need to go back and include the why and the impact. I certainly will not include equals in my response, but it's a friendly reminder. Don't forget to include the why and the impact. And then the last part of the narrative is moving expenses. And so Sean is asking us several questions. Let's write those questions down because we need to answer them. So asking about what he can deduct, which expenses are deductible, and is there anything that he needs to know about the eligibility of the move? Plus, he's giving us an important case fact that Luxury, the company, has given him $5,000 towards, his moving expenses. So we need to consider that. So at this point, we have now completed and read the entire narrative. So we've done step 2. Now, step 3 is to scan the appendices and reread the required. So at this point, I would be taking that blank page and I'd write down all of the required. So we've got the best model, funding, grant, audit procedures, SWOT, and moving expenses. So let's quickly look at the appendices. And all that is just kind of looking through them. Hey, Appendix 1, industry information. I know if I see industry information or marketing information, that's going to be very useful for my SWOT. Second appendices is all about the appropriate business model. Third one, here's all the information I'm going to need for funding sources, the account for the grant, and the audit procedures. And then the last appendices is the moving expenses. So step 4 is now about going through each of those appendices and extracting the relevant case facts. So we're going to look at the first appendix. There's lots of information here that I can use my SWOT analysis. There's 4 opportunities and there's 3 threats. So let's extract that information, include it in my outline, and I'm going to again include that equal sign because that's going to remind me, go back and include the why and the impact. So as you can see, we've already got a really good SWOT analysis ready. So let's look at Appendix 2. And this best practice I'm going to share with you is appropriate, and it's been shared with me by several candidates I've worked over the years that have done extremely well in the professional education program, and they've done very well. They've passed CFE the first time. And one of the things that they said is when they were looking at the appendices and the numbers, they felt that they needed to kind of do something concretely with them. So as they're creating their outline, what they've done, and this only works for day 3, is they've extracted the relevant information and included it in Excel because ultimately that's where they're going to perform the calculations. And I want to be very clear. This adds a little bit more time on the front end when it comes to creating your outline and planning, but on the back end of creating your response, it reduces it. But this is not an effective strategy as far as including the quantitative information in Excel for day 2. For day 2, please watch, if you haven't had the opportunity yet, please watch the Path to Competent and day 2, where I create a partial outline. And that you would include the appendices number and then maybe grab some of the important quantitative information. But here, let's extract that. Let's put it in Excel. I'm going to put a purpose, so it's to determine the profitability, and I'm going to put the relevant information in. Do not start to calculate. That is really important. You're just in the planning process. There's more information here when it comes to from threats perspective. So let's add those in. Keep that equal sign there so that you make sure that you're including the why and the impact. So in Appendix 2, there's also information as far as costing. So let's take that information and input it in Excel. If you notice for the notes, what I've done is all of the solutions, they'll have the notes at the bottom. And that requires more scrolling up and down. So if possible, if it's easy, just have the notes off to the side. And if it's not easy, you put the notes at the bottom. So I'm showing you both ways. You do not need to put notes in if you're just going to take a number exactly how it is out of the appendices. When you look at the solutions, they will include a note, but they're including a note, uh, you know, as per Appendix 2, because they want you to know where they found that information. So in this aspect, there are a few notes that I need to include. For construction labor, so for the second model, for where the participant is also part of helping with the structure of the tiny home, there is a difference in the cost. So again, I put that in there so that the marker knows what I've done, and how come I've arrived at $2,000 instead of $10,000. Because again, think about the fact that the marker isn't able to say, send me a text and ask me, how did I arrive at that $2,000? So it's important to provide notes for inputs that you need to put a particular calculation. One of the things was that the fixed costs, for the most part, are the same, the overhead costs, except after it meets a particular level. So after you've exceeded, I think it was 15 tiny homes, the overhead is 160,000 versus 100,000. So what I'm going to do is my first calculation is going to be, I'll just take the cost per unit. I'll get that from my second exhibit. And then I've included my note for the overhead. So if you were a little bit uncertain of what type of quantitative analysis you need to perform, once you saw that overhead, and it was different depending on the number of homes constructed, that was your trigger that you needed to calculate the profitability. So here are Appendix 3. Here are the different funding sources. So I'm going to extract the relevant information. There's 5 different sources. They're providing me with some facts. So I'm just going to extract it right now. Later on, I will divide it and have advantages and disadvantages for each of those options. And then, of course, provide the user with a recommendation. So here's more information about the grant. And what I tend to do is I tend to pull that information out and I just put it under the issue statement at the moment. Most of that is not going to stay there. It's going to be information that I'm going to need for my analysis. But let's just put it there because again, I have the advantage of being able to move that information around. So we know how much money that they've received, but what's interesting is that there are stipulations. So there's 350,000 for operating expenses, of which 60,000 must be spent each year for the 4 years, and there's 200,000 for the capital expenditures. So what's happening now is I know that I need to talk about how to account for the funds received. And so when I'm looking at the analysis, I need to talk about the recognition for the operating expenses, the recognition for the capital expenses. I need to provide recommendations for each of those separately. Plus, I need to also talk about and analyze the repayment. So this is becoming very complex. I can't lump all of this together. So I'm going to deal with how to account for the funds received is going to be one of my financial reporting issues. And the other is going to be how to account for the potential repayments. Because if it's not spent, the full amount must be repaid March 31st. Then there's also some information there that was provided for the grant that are great discussion points when I talk about the advantages and disadvantages of that particular funding source. So it's 550, it's not 600,000. The full amount is forgivable. providing they provide an audited report. And if the requirements are not met, then it must be repaid in March 31st. So again, we've got a lot of the relevant information that we can turn that into an advantage and disadvantage analysis. So let's talk about, so then the next requirement is, here are the grant requirements. And it's specific things that need to be done. So the risk is that each of these things were not done. I need to discuss each of them, identify the risk for each one of these separately. That does not impact an account. Assertion isn't appropriate, so I don't need to do the A part of RAP. So I'm just going to identify the risk and provide a procedure for as many of each of those individual requirements as I can within the time that I have. The last required is we need to calculate that net moving expenses. And so what happens is if there is more than 9 lines when it comes to financial information, there's an extra tab where that information will be given to you. So you have the ability to actually copy that information. So it's on an extra tab. You can copy that information and input it into the tab where you can perform the calculations. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy that information. Now, when I go to prepare my response and prepare that calculation, I'm going to end up having Word on one side of my screen, Excel on another side of the screen, and as I'm putting in my notes and so on, one of the things I need to talk about is if an item is not deductible, I need to explain to Sean why. Or if the full amount is not deductible, I need to explain the reason why. So again, having Word up and Excel up at the same time to answer this required is a very important strategy. So let me show you what this pre-populated financial information is going to look like. It's important to note that in Excel within Surpass, the secure exam software, there's only one tab that you can actually calculate information. So sheet 1. You're going to be given for day 1, you'll have English and French. So again, if there's more than 10 lines, that information is there. You could copy it and put it into sheet 1. It will save you some time. Day 2, there's going to be a common section, English and French. So again, you can copy that information, put it into your sheet. Plus, there's going to be a tab for each of the roles. So if you're performance management and you're writing an English exam, then that's the only tab that you would take that information, anything that you need, and copy and paste it into sheet 1. Day 3, you're going to have a tab for English and for French for each case. So again, make sure that you take full advantage of that. So at this point, let's talk about the remaining few steps. So you're going to take an opportunity to reflect. Step 6 is all about planning what you're going to do. Well, the best practice I showed you, you already have your plan in place. You already know what type of quantitative analysis you're going to do because you've got that general information and set up already. You know the types of recommendations you need to provide. You know the content that you need to cover. When it comes to ordering the requireds, an important question you have to ask yourself is, does your analysis of any of the requireds, and your recommendations, do they impact your analysis and recommendations for another required? If that's the case, then you need to perform that particular assessment opportunity first. So some clear examples, and I gave that yesterday, was if there's financial reporting issues and you're going to calculate materiality, you need to do your financial reporting issues, make the appropriate adjustments before you calculate materiality. Another common one is transfer pricing. If you're asked to provide a recommendation when it comes to transfer pricing, you need to do that assessment opportunity first, make the changes, and then assess the division's performance. In this instance, you do have a financial reporting issue, but it's not going to have an impact on any of the other assessment opportunities you need to analyze. So you can actually complete them in the order that you're given. That isn't always the case. Make sure you have a clear understanding of, does my analysis have an impact to any of the other assessment opportunities? So before I talk about allocating your time, which is your last step, I want to talk about the common time management challenges. And what happens is sometimes candidates spend too much time in certain assessment opportunities, and they do that for two reasons. It could be something that you really love. So you're like, this is great. I know exactly what I'm doing. So you spend a disproportionate amount of time of completing that assessment opportunity. Could be something that you're really not sure what you need to do. You're uncomfortable. It's technically you have challenges, and so you end up spending again a disproportional amount of time on that assessment opportunity. What happens? You run out of time. Lots of time too, you'll run out of time because what I've seen is I've actually seen as an exam supervisor, I'm always walking around and saying, are they allocating their time? Are they watching their time? And I see candidates allocate their time, but they don't stick to it. So it's not only about allocating it, it's about following that time. Because again, when I talked about, and if you haven't had a chance, watch that Understanding CFE, because you need to, the fundamental principle is complete all of the required to the best of your ability within the time frame that you have, because that increases your chances of passing level 1, 2, 3, and 4 that's needed to pass the combined day 2 and day 3. So when it comes to time allocation, what are some tips? Make sure that you write down that start time and that stop time. Watch that clock. Okay. You have to move on. One of the things we always talk about is done is better than perfect. Now, caution about adjusting your time. Remember, all of those requireds need to be done. So think about it as you've got 5 requireds that you need to do. Required assessment opportunities, all the same, what you're being asked to analyze. If you steal 1 or 2 minutes here or there, say you steal 2 minutes each. Now all of a sudden, case 1, you're 10 minutes behind. You start case 2. You end up stealing 5 minutes. Now you're 15 minutes behind before you've even started to write case 3. 15 minutes means that you probably aren't going to be able, you're going to miss 2 assessment opportunities and may not be able to complete another one. That could be detrimental to your success. That could be the reason you don't pass. So you must manage your time carefully. So before we even go over the time allocation, I want to share with you. So here is that outline. Here's what it actually looks like in Word. You'll notice that I've kind of crossed out. I'm going to get rid of, I'm going to delete that information. So here is everything that you have. And so when you determine how much time you need to allocate to each assessment opportunity, it should be based on what do you already have in your outline. How quickly can you turn it into a response? Let's look at Excel. Well, my goodness, there's not an awful lot that I need to do when it comes to determining the appropriate business model and the selling price. I've got a lot of information already. So in this aspect for reading, outlining, and planning, I created It took me 25 minutes. Best model, I need 5 minutes. SWAT, 5 minutes maximum. For the funding and grant, need a little bit more time. For audit procedures, you know what, I'm going to allocate 8 minutes and I'm going to do it. Identify as many risks and provide as many detailed procedures as I can. Tax, I'm going to leave 7 minutes. I'm going to leave a little bit of time at the end to go back and make sure, quickly go through my response and make sure that I've done everything I needed to do. So again, you'll see I haven't allocated evenly the time across the board to each of the requirements. I've based it on what information do I already have. So the tips for success. Time management is a challenge for most candidates. Well, the only way that you can ensure that you're managing your time effectively is you need to practice writing the cases in the recommended time. You need to have a good sense of what you can do within the time frame that you have. Not only allocate the time, but stick to the time allocations. If you get stuck on an issue, move on. Don't sit there and stress, because what happens is as you get stressed, you really struggle to kind of think about what do you need to do. If you let it go and move on, insights will come to you. And then you quickly write down what you need to do and then go back to it. So let's talk about some of the triggers that you'll see in the cases. There are direct requests. There are indirect or undirected requests. They can be found in the narrative, and a lot of them are in the narrative, but be on the lookout. There are some requests sometime in the appendices. There's certain words to look for that they're asking you, directs, they're wondering, can you help me? What's your view? So what are some examples of direct requirements? These are easy. So they're saying they want you to prepare evaluation. They want you to provide an analysis. They want you to review a proposal. So those ones are easy to find. There are what we call the indirect requirements. Here are some common things. So when you hear these, think about it from a skepticism perspective and know that this is an indirect requirement that you need to analyze and provide a recommendation. So something could be confusing to the user. Or, you know what? And they're kind of using words like, oh, I'm a little bit unsure about this. I've probably done this correctly. Something the user says that they don't have, and you're thinking, but they do need that. Something the user thinks is correct. Oh, yes, I recorded that revenue for the signing bonus. I recorded that as revenue, the full amount. And you're thinking, hmm, that's a financial reporting issue. I need to look at and analyze when the revenue, that signing bonus, should be recognized and at what amount. A hitting issue that they don't know about, or something that needs to be addressed that needs to address the user's objectives or their concerns. What's the importance? How important is it to address each of those users' requests? Well, whether it's direct or indirect, that is a required. A required is an assessment opportunity. And your performance against those assessment opportunities determine whether you meet the requirements for level 1, 2, 3, and 4. So they determine whether you pass or fail. A very important hockey player, Wayne Gretzky, has said, Canadian hockey player, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So if you don't attempt a user's request, you're guaranteed to get an NA, not addressed. And we know that that is not going to count towards any of the requirements for each of the levels. And again, if you're thinking, I'm not exactly sure what Debbie's talking about, that's no problem. Make sure you go back and watch Understanding the CFE, because I go into great detail. It's important to know how CFE is marked. So let's talk about the different quantitative tools. And I've highlighted all of this information I've taken out of the ebook, the Management Accounting book. So I'm going to focus on a lot of the key quantitative analysis and the types of answers they provide. Cost, volume, profit analysis. Well, that assists in pricing. That helps analyze the impact the change of volume has or the change of cost has in short-term profits. The most popular one is that analyzes how the mix of profit of products affects profit. So there's several types of quantitative tools. And when I look at the the competency map and that Excel spreadsheet and I'm sorting it, and again, I share that in stress management webinar. These are, I'm not mistaken, they're all proficiency level A, so they're very testable. I need to know them well. Break even, what's the minimum units or revenue that you need to cover fixed costs and variable costs? Target profit, so what's the sales units or dollars that you need to attain a particular level of profit? Point of indifference, that's where the decision maker's benefit is equal for two or more decisions. In the professional education program, there's only one instance that I've ever seen the point of indifference, and that was in Core 2, the module workshop. And I'd say 90% of the candidates had no idea how to calculate it. This is proficiency level A. Write yourself a note. If you don't know how to calculate point of indifference, you need to review that as part of your study plan. I know it's been on CFE before and candidates have done poorly. Contribution analysis. Please make sure that you're comfortable with contribution analysis. The first thing when you're looking at and it's appropriate to calculate contribution, right away, think about, is there is there constraint? If there is, you need to calculate contribution margin per constraint. Variance analysis. Well, again, proficiency level A. So that breaks down the costs that relate to price and quantity. It helps the company kind of troubleshoot for unexpected results, know what they need to investigate. It helps promote that learning and continuous improvement. So there's several calculations that you should be very comfortable with. Flexible budget variance, sales volume variance, sales price variance. These are not, those have been asked on CFE. They haven't been as predominant in the professional education program, and candidates have done poorly. You need to be comfortable with all of the variance analysis calculations, the price or rate variance, efficiency variance, and know that lots of times you're going to have to calculate something to determine what the standard quantity is. It's not going to be straightforward because it's proficiency level A. Capital budgeting. So determining the profitability of a capital investment. It helps the user make those long-term decisions when they're looking at large capital expenditures. So what types of tools? Net present value. Need to be very comfortable in calculating net present value. And that, of course, adjusts cash flow for the time value of money using an appropriate discount factor. Now, I want to highlight a few important things. If you're looking at opening a new division, when you're looking at your cash flow to determine your net present value, you only consider the incremental revenue and the incremental costs. You're not going to include the sales of the existing division. Only include incremental revenue and costs. You also need to include any relevant opportunity costs. So say if they open another division, and that means that they're no longer able to produce 500 units of a particular product, you're going to have to add an opportunity cost. It's going to be a negative outflow of cash. It's going to be the loss contribution margin for those 500 units that you can no longer produce. Best practices are make sure that you create a shell. You know what needs to be done in year zero, your initial investments, the present value of a tax shield. Make sure that you know how to handle the working capital, how you handle salvage value. So make sure that you have an idea of what needs to be included in each of the years. Also, a great time saver is make sure that you can calculate the present value of an annuity. Another quantitative capital budgeting tool is to calculate the internal rate of return. So that's going to calculate the discount factor for that project that would result in a zero NPV. Payback period that measures how long an investment takes to pay itself back. These are all popular calculations that you should be able to easily perform. Valuation, that's determining the value of an asset or the value of the company's assets or the value of a business. So the types of quantitative tools, an adjusted net asset valuation. And you would use that if the company doesn't have an active operations or if they don't have any earnings, or you want to determine what's the floor value. So what's the value of the company's assets? An income-based approach. And that you use when the entity is a going concern, it's making profits, and it's an active operations. Market-based approach. And that's when there's publicly traded information that's available and that you can use them as comparables. And that helps you determine the fair market value. So these are all, again, quantitative analysis you should be comfortable with and able to perform. Financial statement analysis. Well, that helps determine the financial health of a company. It helps you're able to compare the company's performance to industry benchmarks. You're able to identify trends and identify issues. So the types of analysis you can perform. Horizontal trend. So compare financial information over a time period. Vertical trend, or what's also referred to as common size trend. And that's where you compare one account against one specific line. Normally it's revenue. Ratio analysis provides lots of valuable insight. Assess the company profitability, liquidity, asset management, solvency. It allows you to compare their performance with industry. If you are given more than 1 year of financial information and you need to perform ratio calculations, you need to discuss the trend year over year. Is the ratio improving? Is it getting worse or is it stable? Why is it getting worse? It's got to be based on case facts. You can't simply say the current ratio has improved, and that's because the company has more cash on hand. Why? Based on case facts, do they have more cash on hand? Saying they have more cash on hand, that's basic math. Costing methods. So job costing, that's where products or service is uniquely identified. Process costing. So that's where there's mass production of identical products. Activity-based costing. Proficiency level A. And this is where repeatedly candidates historically perform very poorly when it comes to activity-based costing. Please make sure that that's on your list to review because you need to determine what drives that cost. You need to define the different cost pools, determine the appropriate cost base, and then calculate the allocation rate. Joint product costing. And that's where at some point there's more than one product and they're not identifiable until a certain point, that split off point. So these are all costing methods that you need to be familiar with. There's also, not only from a quantitative perspective, and there's a quantitative portion here in regards to pricing strategies, and there's also qualitative information that you need to be comfortable with. So cost-based pricing strategies. So cost plus is adding a certain markup to your selling price. Variable is adding a certain percentage to your variable cost to determine your selling price. Full absorption cost pricing is your selling price will include all of your costs, including fixed costs. Life cycle cost pricing. That's calculating the selling price to determine the maximum profits over the product's entire life cycle. It's important for you to be able to talk about the different demand pricing strategies. Know what they are. What are the advantages? When would they be applicable? Because you could be asked to provide a recommendation. Transfer pricing. Now there's 3 different options: cost-based transfer pricing, market-based, or negotiating transfer pricing. Make sure you know some general advantages and disadvantages for each of these options. When it comes to the negotiating transfer price, there's some important information you must provide to the user. What's the minimum price that one division should be transferring that product to another internal division? And what's the maximum price? The minimum price is determined on a very important case fact. Are they operating at full capacity? And could they sell that product externally? Is there an external market for it? If there is, the minimum price is the variable cost plus the opportunity cost. So in this instance, if they could have sold it externally for $10, the minimum transfer price to the division should be $10. If there's excess capacity, then the minimum price that they should be transferring, and there's excess capacity, you should be recommending variable cost. So be very comfortable with transfer pricing. So now let's talk a little bit about writing strategies. The common challenges the Board of Examiners see is that the responses are not clear and concise, that the candidates have failed to answer that question, so what? Why is it an advantage or a disadvantage? Why is it a strength? Why is it a weakness? What's the potential positive or negative impact to the company? The objective when you write your response is to make sure that your response is marker friendly. It's clear and concise. Sometimes I see candidates and they're writing qualitative factors and it ends up being 4 lines. You should be able to identify the case, state the case fact, and include the why and impact in no more than 2 lines. Make sure that it's well organized. Every word that you use is chosen carefully. So when you write, start practicing and writing practice cases. When you're debriefing, look very seriously at what you wrote and say, cross out the information that was unnecessary. You need to teach your brain how to write clear and concise. Make sure that your response is assertive and confident. Make sure that when you provide recommendations that they're supported. And I talked about that yesterday. A supported recommendation is not simply stating, based on my quantitative and qualitative analysis, I recommend implementing this option. No, that's not a supported recommendation. Highlight the strongest quantitative and qualitative reasons why, because not all qualitative factors are equal. So what are the top 2 or 3 reasons why you aren't recommending that option? So it's important to practice writing concisely. This information all came from the Enabling Competency ebook, Chapter 21. So you might want to refer to that. The fundamental principle is less is more. So make sure that you're providing enough detail, but no more than necessary. Don't provide and go off on a tangent and provide information that they didn't ask you for. When you're explaining technical information, use plain English. Explain it in layman's terms that anyone could easily understand. Avoid those long sentences and paragraphs. Eliminate information that's unnecessary. When techniques to reduce your wordiness is say, is that information important? Is that phrase important? Take some of those, convert some of your clauses or phrase. Can you say it in 1 or 2 words? Combine some of those sentences into one single concise sentence. Again, group elements of your issues together. So if you are asked, say you have a financial reporting issues, plus you're asked to identify risks and provide procedures, then what you can do is do the assessment, do the financial reporting issue first, analysis, and then underneath it, have the risk, assertion, accounts, and the procedure. Again, clear, concise, easy to follow. Here is an example of a response that a candidate did on an exam. Here is all that they needed to say. So instead of the first response was over 110 words, all it needed to be done is make sure that response clear, is concise, it's 37 words. The reason I'm showing you this is because if you're putting unnecessary information, if you're elaborating in too much detail, that is having a negative impact on your ability to complete all of the assessment opportunities within the time frame that you have. So let's talk about those discussion frameworks, those structures that you should use. Went into great detail yesterday when, again, that was the path to competent and day 2 around the structure you should use for financial reporting issues. So IGAR, I say IGAR I, so issue, gap, analysis, and recommendation. I want to highlight here, so I've taken a section out of the competency map. If you notice here, all of these are proficiency level A. So you are going to be tested at proficiency level A for any of these financial reporting issues. What does that mean? You need to know them very well. You should be comfortable enough that you can paraphrase the criteria on your own so that you're not always having to look into the handbook. So again, make sure that you're very comfortable with those requirements from a proficiency A perspective. Go through, if you haven't yet, the stress management webinar. Download the Excel spreadsheet. Sort it by proficiency levels because that's going to help you concentrate on and identifying the areas you need to focus on when it comes to your study plan. WIR format. This is a great format. W stands for weakness or issue or risk. I for implication, R for recommendation. It's used in instances where you're asked to critique. So things like identifying internal controls, assessing the current governance structure, looking at the proposed terms of a contract, or assessing a junior auditor's work. When you're asked to create an audit planning memo, think of RAMP. You need to address risk, approach, materiality, and procedures. When you're communicating those procedures, again, the appropriate discussion structure to use is risk, RAMP, risk, accounts, and assertions, procedures. And within the procedures, think of VP, DP. So you need to verb, what do they need to do? You need to talk about the population. What type of document do they need and the purpose? And I've included the appropriate chapter in the ebook where I found this information. In order to meet the depth requirement, let's go through some clear examples and what you need to do. When it comes to alignment with the company's mission, vision, or values, you can't simply just say it's aligned with the company's mission. That is not enough. You need to talk about the how. And next week, I'm going to go in greater detail when I go over the day one webinars. Key success factors. You need to not only talk about the how, but you also need to include the why and the impact. You perform a SWOT, a PESTLE, look at the pros and cons. You always need to state the why and the impact. So let's look at the depth framework. So you need to state the case fact, that's the what. Use a linking word, whether it's therefore, whatever word you're comfortable with, and then talk about the implication, that why, what's that potential positive or negative impact. Here's a case fact, significant increase in the number of competitors. So what? Why is that a threat? The words I'm using as link, which could result in lower sales than projected. That is my why and my impact. Now I've achieved a depth on that particular qualitative factor. So I want to just take a moment to highlight data analytics and information systems. So you are going to be tested on data analytics and information systems. If you look under section 6 in the knowledge list and examples, particular section 6.7, it'll talk about the areas that you need to know well. The Management Accounting ebook, chapter 27 to 30, provides some great information. And there's also an information technology ebook. So here are some examples of what the Board of Examiners from the reports that they've asked in the past, that you needed to identify patterns from data analysis, that you needed to provide audit procedures against data analytics, to evaluate the systems, to assess the reporting systems, the quality of the data, to assess the business practices, to perform a data analysis to identify the anomalies. Again, they could give you that information in that extra tab in Excel, and you need to sort it so you can identify the anomalies. So you have to copy it. Candidates were given it, and they never performed that analysis. So I want to share with you the resources that I used to create this webinar. Quantitative tools, all from the Management Accounting ebook. I've got the chapters here and how you can assess it. Since everyone has access to Capstone 2 and CFE, I have the specific instructions of where you can find that information. For the writing and discussing frameworks, again, that came from the ebooks, and I have the chapters here. For the competency map and that competency tool, so that Excel, here's the instructions of how to pull that information up. For the flashcards, very helpful. You can print those. I've got that included here. For the Board of Examiner reports, I've got how you can access that. So you have access to Part A covers day 2 and day 3. Part 3 covers day 1. So you have access to the Board of Examiners reports that have the cases, that have marking guides, and that have sample passing responses from May 2025 all the way back through to May 2026. There are some great practice cases that you can access. Show you how to do that here. There's 18 units within Introduction to Capstone 2 and CFE. So there's 16 day 3 cases and 2 day 2 cases. And of course, a very valuable resource is the webinar series. This was created based on the last 7 years of the Board of Examiners reports, the information that they said that was important and the challenges that candidates face. So stress management, that recording's available. So is understanding CFE. For the day 2, path to competent, and day 3 and time management, those recordings will be available shortly. Next week on April the 8th, I'm going to do day 1 for those of you who are going to be rating the Garnet Bread Company. And for those of you who are writing Viviana's, I'm going to go through that on April the 9th. So again, you can find the recordings where you found access to register for this particular webinar on the homepage for Introduction to Capstone 2 and CFE. So now I'd like to open the floor for any questions that you have.
All right, now thanks there, Debbie, for the presentation tonight. So we'll have about 10 minutes approximately for tonight's Q&A. Just a couple admin items to note. We included a link to a survey to get your guys' feedback in regards to tonight's webinar and all the CFE support webinars to date. So if you get the chance, can you please take the time out? It only takes like a couple minutes just to give your feedback, just to make sure we're on track with in terms of the response there. But yeah, questions have been coming in there, Debbie. So I kind of categorize them into particular themes there for you. So just to note, so we'll kind of start with this one here. So this has to do more with kind of case writing and everything like that there. So you did mention it in the presentation, but that's a good one just to note here. So the question came up as like this. Can the writer, like when they do their analysis, utilize short paragraphs, like potentially like 2 lines for conclusions, recommendation, quality analysis, and so forth, etc. So I think what they're looking for is, are they able to use bullet points? Are they able to be direct just to help save time in regards to their analysis there?
Sure. So you're going to use a combination of short sentences, bullet points. Like when you're doing your qualitative analysis, it should always be done in bullet point. When you're looking at your analysis for a financial reporting issue, the best practice is to state, paraphrase the criteria in your own words, and then under it in bullet point, put what the appropriate case fact is, and then under that, state whether that criterion is met or not. So yes, you can do a combination. You don't want the whole entire response to be in bullet point, but you should not have these long paragraphs. So short sentences, few sentences here and there, and then bullet point is very acceptable. The only thing I'd like to caution you is when you do have bullet points, make sure that you finished your thought, that you have your full thought, because sometimes we fall into that trap.
All right. No, thanks for that there. Yeah. So you might be hearing this a couple of times there. This is just more to reiterate for everybody what best practices are there when creating your response. Thanks there, Debbie. This will be another one in line with more case writing and using Excel. So the question that came in here was that the candidate was asking, is it okay to do their writing analysis in Excel when using quants, or should it be that the quants are more for Excel and any qualitative analysis should be put in Word?
Absolutely. Okay, so first of all, Excel is to be used to perform your quantitative analysis. It is not where your response should be included. Your response should be created in Word. Okay, so it's very clear. Excel is to crunch the numbers. Word is where your response is. So again, you do not use Excel to create your response. And when it comes to your quantitative analysis, you're going to perform that in Excel. And then in Word, as I shared yesterday, what you're going to do under your quantitative analysis is state the result. There's three required. You're going to state that NPV is, positive $100,000, bracket C Exhibit 1.1 or C Exhibit 1, and then state what's that interpretation. So in other words, that means from a quantitative perspective, it's a viable option. So you only need to have two short sentences, but that information needs to be included in your word response. Don't just say see exhibit 1. So hopefully that helps.
All right, perfect. No, thanks there, Debbie. Yeah, so there's different ways I would say you guys can structure your response there, but what Debbie's mentioned there, try to implement those best practices wherever you can to help with the topic of time management. I saw a question that came in, and I'm gonna bring this question in because it's one that I think a lot of candidates are gonna feel as they progress through from now until June in terms of writing the CFE there. So the question that came in here, Debbie, is the candidate is finding that it's often difficult to attain depth, and a lot of it is due to time constraints, especially for day three compared to the day two cases there. So I know you talked about general time management tips there, but what would you suggest in terms of advice there for candidates who are potentially struggling right at the beginning where it's like, ooh, there's a lot to do, there's a lot to write. How are we going to get through in terms
Okay.
of creating the response there?
Yeah, and I love that question. So, first of all, I want to say with full confidence, the first time you write a day three case, a day one case, or a day two case, you are going to feel overwhelmed. It's natural, it's okay. And I know every single time I've been a session leader for Capstone 2, people just almost feel like anything that they did know, they've completely forgotten. So know that that is natural. Know that you need to practice. And as you're practicing, you're going to get better at knowing what types of information you need to include. So think about it in the context of one of the things I was speaking to someone I was coaching one on one. And I said, when it comes to materiality, what are the key discussion points that you need to do? You'll get a better sense of that as you practice. These are the key discussion points. Put that structure in your outline, and then you've already got it there, and then you just need to include a few sentences as you go along. So your ability to meet the depth is going to take practice. And it's going to take a while. Do not be discouraged. You need to debrief. Make some notes. So you're saying, next time I have a required that's covering this kind of, particular technical competency or technical task, make yourself a list of these are the points that I need to cover and keep practicing because what will happen, you'll be able to do that much quicker. Practice is, I cannot discount it. Sometimes people say, oh, they're just telling me I have to practice more. Well, practice is an important piece of getting better. And make sure that that outline, if it's just a shell with the required and it took you 20 minutes to do that, opposed to what I showed you as a best practice of 25 minutes, that 25 minutes is going to significantly increase your chances of meeting the breadth and the depth requirements for a competent response.
No, thanks there, Debbie, for that there. Yeah, it's one where it's not about how well you're doing today. It's about how well you're feeling on those dates at the beginning of June. So don't worry if you end up feeling like, oh, I'm not getting this or anything like that there. Everyone who's gone through the exam and everything like that, I remember it where I was like, yeah, you're struggling in the beginning, but afterwards you will see improvement in regards to that there. So don't feel defeated in regards to
No,
that
don't.
point. It's a gradual increase, and you guys will see it at a point where like, oh, I got this and everything like that. But I'm glad you mentioned that there, Debbie. Practice makes perfect, but there's a balance and don't burn yourself out. So
Oh,
I'm
no,
going to
don't.
promote the stress management webinar. So just to put
Yes.
tips in
Absolutely.
regards to that there. All right, so we have time for about one or two more questions, and we do apologize that I got my thanks to my colleagues in the background who are answering some of the questions that come in regards to there. But this is an important question. Want to kind of it just came up which I saw there. So the candidate was asking, so when they receive a case, is there a particular order they must follow when writing a case response? So, for example, like should they address the MA opportunities first before financial reporting or finance or something like that there? Or should they spend more time in one area versus another? Want to get your thoughts there, Debbie, on that question.
Sure. Well, no problem. Well, first of all, the case is going to dictate the order in which you need to complete those requirements. So again, one of the steps in the planning process is to ask yourself, is there any examples of integration? So does your analysis of one of the required impact your analysis of another? So I provided those very clear examples, and they're very common. Transfer pricing. If you have transfer pricing, even though it might not be the most important required, but you're going to have to do some other kind of quantitative analysis, you need to deal with that required first and then make the appropriate adjustments before you perform other calculations. If there's financial reporting issues and you need, most likely you're going to need to make some adjustments. And there's other requirements where you need to take that information, so maybe calculate business income or so on. You're going to have to do the financial reporting issues first to be able to complete the other requirements. So again, the case dictates the requireds within the case, and whether they impact analysis of another dictates the order that you should be completing those. So again, sometimes we hear this strategy of, day two, that it's important that that's the only day that you're going to be tested on the depth in your role. And I know that some candidates have shared that, well, I'm going to make sure that I do my role specific. I'm going to do those first. That's not an appropriate strategy in the aspect of if some of those other requirements are going to impact the analysis that you're doing for your role, you're now you're now negatively impacting your ability to get a competent response on your role specific. So it needs to be dictated by the impact each of those requirements has on each other, which means you have to manage your time very carefully. What we've noticed is for those of you who were in the professional education program, and I've been an exam supervisor for a very long time, when you wrote Core 1, most candidates used much more time to write their response in the day one for their one case. They stole time from the multiple choice. Candidates have used the philosophy of stealing time and trying to figure out strategies. In the end, that's not an effective strategy because in order to pass CFE, you need to complete all of the assessment opportunities to the best of your ability.
All right. No, thanks there, Debbie, in regards to that there. So I did see a lot of questions that came up about day one. So just to let you guys know, next week, so Debbie will be going through day one tips, and she'll be going through specifically both day one cases. So the Cornet Bread Company and as well as Viviana's there. So what we highly recommend is that you don't need to register for both. Just want to let you guys know that there. So register for the one for the case that you are specifically writing about for next week. And those webinars will be a little bit longer in depth because Debbie will be going through it in a lot more detail. So just to let you guys know there. So in terms of registration, where to register, just go to that newsfeed post on the introduction to Capstone 2 webpage, and you will be able to find the link for registration. And yeah, in terms of the links to today's recordings and any prior recordings, we'll post the direct link on the Introduction to Capstone 2 web pages. Each year, regions will post that once it becomes available. So we'll be working towards that in regards to there. And then you'll be able to access the recording and everything like that. You just won't get access to the slide deck. All right, so we are at the end of today's webinar. So on behalf of the CP Western School of Business, CP Ontario, CP Atlantic School of Business, and the rest of the other CP provincial bodies, we thank you for attending today's webinar. And thank you, Debbie, for
You're welcome.
hosting the webinar today. I've included a link here to the feedback survey. We
Yes, please
appreciate
do.
any all feedback that's received there. So please fill that out. So it makes us know that we're on the right path. And if there's any other topics you guys like to see, well, we can adjust accordingly there. But other than that, have a great rest of your evening there, and we'll see you at the next webinar session.